All right, so we are just having our attendees start coming in. Going to give everyone just a little bit as they get settled. It's always that wild rush to the beginning of a Zoom as people go, oh yeah, that thing. So, thank you everyone, both here in our Zoom and watching on Facebook Live, for joining us this evening. We are here to celebrate Natalie Walton's debut novel, Revenge of the Sluts, and this event is co-sponsored by Speak About It. Just a quick reminder to everyone, Natalie will be answering questions after the presentation. And if you look to the bottom of your screen, if you're on the Zoom, there is a Q&A function. You can submit your questions through there. On Facebook Live, you can comment questions there as well, and I will feed them into our conversation here. And of course, we have copies of Revenge of the Sluts available for sale on our website if you'd like to add a copy of it to your home library. I am adding that link into our chat right now, and it is linked on the Facebook Live event as well. One last thing before we begin, I wanted to let everyone know about another YA event we have coming up. On Monday, March 1st, we'll be hosting Olivia Chada and Kat Valente to discuss Olivia's novel, Rise of the Red Hand. I'm going to be dropping a link to our full calendar events on the Zoom now for reference. And now, without any further ado, it is my honor to introduce Natalie Walton and her in-conversation partner this evening, Shafia Zaloom. Natalie Walton has been writing for as long as she can remember, completing her first book in second grade. She began posting her stories on Wattpad at the age of 14 and has since amassed over 18 million views. Natalie is a Delaware resident and wrote Revenge of the Sluts while being a full-time student at the University of Delaware, working towards her degree in sociology and criminal justice. Shafia Zaloom is a health educator, parent, and consultant, as well as an author whose work centers on human development, community building, ethics, and social justice. Her approach involves creating opportunities for students and teachers to discuss the complexities of teen culture and decision-making with straightforward, open, and honest dialogue. Shafia's book, Sex, Teens, and Everything in Between, has been reviewed as the ultimate relationship guide for teens of all orientations and identities. Shafia is currently the health teacher at the Urban School in San Francisco and develops curriculum and trainings for schools across the country. Her work has been featured by many media outlets, including the New York Times, USA Today, NPR, KQED, and PBS. I will drop a link to where you can purchase her book now as well. And last but not least, our co-sponsor this evening, Speak About It, is a nonprofit consent education organization based in Portland, Maine. Speak About It uses theater and dialogue to engage schools and communities in Maine and across the country in preventing violence, promoting sexual health, autonomy, and pleasure. And they are building a culture of consent. Here is a link to their website for more information. Now that all of the technical side is out of the way, I will pass it over to the both of you. I'm very excited for your conversation.
Thank you. So Natalie, I was so excited to read your book, Revenge of the Sluts, because I feel like it's a really excellent way by which adults can have substantive conversations with the kids they parent. And specifically, we're talking later middle school, high school, and beyond. But that really is the sweet spot, I feel like, for how this book can serve a role in really meaningful dialogue amongst parenting adults and the kids that they care about. What's it like? So I'd love to talk about that, but first I want to hear, like, what's it like to finally have your book in print? I know I always read the acknowledgments, and I saw that you have been wanting to write and publish a book since you were 7 years old, and now it has happened. Um, and you're a very young author, like, which is so exciting, and it's such an accomplishment. So can you share with us a little bit about what your experience has been of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been super weird because I pretty much announced my book and then I think everything shut down like almost immediately after because of COVID. So it's kind of one of those like I got a little bit of celebration kind of in the normal pre-COVID world, and now it's just kind of been adjusting as everything's happening with COVID. So it's definitely been a really interesting and I think a very unique process that a lot of other kind of authors are going through right now. But it's still just been so exciting. It's like, I every part of the process has just been a whole like learning experience for me, and it's just been so fun. And I learned that, you know, I really like editing and I like talking to people about my writing, and I kind of like the book writing process even more than I thought I did. So it's been really exciting. I'm like, I look at it and I still am kind of like, oh, I actually wrote that. Like that's not just like a Word document anymore. Like it's an actual physical thing that I can hold in my hands.
Super exciting. Um, yeah, I can imagine that. And that both the other part of it though is, and if you know there is a silver lining, not to silver lining anything, and minimize sort of the impact of COVID and everything else. I certainly get that, but this is a topic that's more relevant than ever when it comes to sexting, nudes, sending nudes, and young people. And I know that, like in my own research, it's true that since the pandemic has started, for those people, and most of the research has been done on adults, but the experts have said that they guess that the same thing is true of younger audiences, is for those who were inclined to sext or to send nudes, that they're doing that a whole lot more maybe than they would have, that there's that group. And then also teenagers who have sort of been on the fence and not really sure may now have crossed over because feeling isolated and whatnot because of COVID and wanting to connect with people and explore a little bit what this is like in the digital space. And then there's another group of kids for whom they never really did, they weren't into it, and they've just kind of shut down a little bit, and aren't doing this, but they're certain but are certainly witnessing these sorts of things happening amongst their friends, or while they're spending so much more time on social media and in the digital space. So I actually think it's incredibly relevant and a great opportunity while we're still all at home so much with, you know, the young people we care about and love, um, that it's an opportunity to read something like this together or to discuss it, which I think is fantastic in terms of the timing. Because I know that there's definitely been a lot of talk about how kids are connecting and communicating now because of the pandemic. And in large part, it's through digital devices. And we know, especially like your book talks about, that, you know, asking for nudes, sending nudes, those sorts of things can be really common amongst teenagers. So the time is right to actually be discussing this more than ever. So what was it you also, I mean, so this topic of revenge porn, naked pictures, photos, sending them, sharing them, um, believing in, you know, your trust of a partner and then having that betrayed, that's that's a big topic. It's certainly relevant, but it's not one that is typically addressed. What inspired you to write the book? And what was that process like a little bit, trying to sort of paint the landscape of adolescence and how this factors into it?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of different factors that kind of played a role. It was, I think the main one was just growing up as a teenager with kind of early access to things like Instagram and Snapchat. It's, you know, when I think about growing up for me, it was things like making a Snapchat for the first time and being like, what is this? Like, what's going on here? What's the point of this? And then things like Instagram, where it's like I still have vivid memories of making an account and like finding my friends on there like for the very first time back in like I don't even know what year that would have been, like 2012 at this point. Um, so I think that was a really huge part of it, was just wanting to kind of capture that feeling of growing up in like this kind of weird where it doesn't feel early because we've had things like Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook and things like that, basically, you know, what feels like forever, but realistically we're still in the very early stages of kind of figuring out how to regulate these websites and figuring out how to kind of carry ourselves, if that makes sense, like what we find appropriate, what other people think is appropriate, you know, things like that, just trying to navigate like what will get you shamed, what's supported, what's celebrated, that kind of idea. So I think just being able to talk about that. And then there's also just the general kind of growing up and studying sociology and criminal justice and things like that. I think I really wanted to kind of capture those themes. So talking about things that I would see like gender dynamics, double standards, things like that.
Well, and I mean, you chose fiction, right? So it's a fictional story, yet I feel like it's so deeply rooted in truth because I hear about these dynamics all the time in my role as a health teacher. And part of what I really try to do is make sure that the curriculum I create is real and relevant. And students talk to me about this sort of thing all the time. And So what I love though is that you creatively through this fiction actually inform young people and their parents, right, of a lot of language that's really important to understand and to know in being savvy when it comes to this issue in particular, refusal skills, what's actually going on for people, how people experience it emotionally when something like this happens. You know, I can provide all the science and the data and the research that exists around this stuff, but when you illuminate it in an interpersonal dynamic with young people and they can relate and empathize, that's going to be what reaches them, I think, most powerfully. So it really is a gift, right? Like it's not just about the sending of nudes or, you know, I love that opening line that was about a pair of boobs. Like, it's not just about that there are so many other aspects of high school interpersonal social dynamics and cultural dynamics and school dynamics that come out in the story that's ripe for conversation in all kinds of ways. There's so many inroads to different topics having to do with adolescence. I really feel like the book does that beautifully. What did you envision? What was your hope for people to take away from this book? Like we've talked about sort of what inspired you, what you were going for, but what is it that you're really hoping it will create in terms of movement?
Yeah, I think in a really roundabout way, it's advocating for better, more efficient sex ed. So I think it's very much kind of tapping into what you do in opening up conversations and being able to say, okay, so we've honestly failed in all these different ways. Here's how we can kind of redirect it and change the conversation a little bit so it's a little less, well, just don't do it, and a little more kind of comprehensive and more of a, okay, this is what could happen if you do make this decision, or these are potential consequences both interpersonally and legally in some cases. Just having a more efficient way of talking to teenagers about the things that they genuinely are curious about. I mean, they ask about it, they wonder, but like, I know when I was growing up, it was kind of this feeling of like, I don't have anybody to go to, so I'm just going to be stuck with these questions, and I might like Google search or something, but like in a general sense, I didn't really have anybody to go to or anybody to talk to about these things. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to provide, was almost a way of kind of introducing sex ed and concepts that we should be taught in sex ed, but in a way that doesn't feel like you're sitting in like a classroom and an adult's talking down to you and is like, don't do it, or all these terrible things are going to happen.
For sure. Like using real life scenarios and stories, that narrative to actually engage kids in how you think about these things. And I think most of us know that just say no and oh is really actually an ineffective, and we've seen that through research, way to approach anything having to do with this, risky behavior with young people, and that it's really just say no, KNOW, that where we empower kids with information and guidance on how to think about these things and how to actually apply that information to real life scenarios that they live is what's going to be most valuable. And I really feel like the book can do that. Can you talk about character development a little bit? I really sort of your intentions behind character development, what it was like to create them. Did your own experience inform how you develop those characters? And then for me too, what I loved is the diverse range of characters, especially amongst young men. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the cast is huge for the book, but I feel very strongly about each one kind of in different ways and the different kind of purpose that they hold and the value that they offer to the story. I think all of them in kind of big or small ways have arcs that they follow. I think I was very, I tried to be as intentional as possible about the different ways that people might realistically respond as a situation kind of evolves in real life. You've Eden, who kind of starts off the book and is just like, like I think she's trying to figure out if she's the main character and why she's the main character in the story, and kind of like where she even fits into all of this. And throughout the story, she kind of starts to figure out, where a bystander might fit in and what a bystander is capable of doing and different roles you can take. Or somebody like Sloane, who's trying to figure out, do I actually want to take on this role in front of everybody? Like, is this something I feel comfortable with, or am I just doing it because I need to? So it's just kind of exploring those. And I also have kind of an interesting like soft spot for the male characters. Like the majority of them are not super pleasant. Like they are kind of like difficult, and they're a little bit like, they're definitely not up with it, I guess, just to, I don't know how else to phrase it. But I think there's room for development, and there's just a really interesting kind of dynamic, and it's a way of starting a conversation, basically. I think that's why I like them so much, is because you can, I think, very easily find people within them, even if it's not like a one-to-one, oh, I went to school with somebody who was like this. You might see different characteristics, and I think it was very human, and it was very much like, okay, these were things that I saw and heard when I was in high school. These are things that I know are still happening and are still talked about. So let me try and find ways of integrating this in without, creating like caricatures. I wanted them to feel authentic in ways, but while still having honest conversations about how people might respond.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I really appreciated Atticus, because I feel like a lot of boys like Atticus get lost in this conversation in particular, that there's a lot of focus on boys who perpetrate, and that then there is this sort of broader brushstroke given to all of that gender versus, really recognizing and understanding that there are boys who aren't interested in doing something like this. And that there also is, you're building empathy in that, understanding where the pressure is for boys to actually also talk about these things, share these things, and what that's like, and how they can resist, and the roles they could play that don't have to fall into reading that script of hypermasculinity in ways that hurts other people. And that the girls too, I don't want to, and no spoiler alerts or anything like that, but also diverse representation amongst the girls, that there really is so much individuality and all kinds of behavior that contributes to culture, right? Like there's individuals, and then there's how we perpetuate, cultivate culture. And the culture that they're all sort of wrestling with, I think, is really highlighted well in its complexities, and can provide insight for adults into what kids are really dealing with on a daily basis. And it's a lot. I also loved how you did this, and maybe you can talk about a couple of the ways you intentionally empower by providing language and role modeling how to use that language when it comes to if someone has been harassed, assaulted, perpetrated against. The research tells us, there's a study that just came out of Boston University that tells us when people experience non-consensual sharing of their photos, that they experience it emotionally. Some people experience it emotionally as if it's trauma that's happened to them in real life. And worst case scenario, we're talking suicidal ideation, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, all kinds of things, especially from the social media exploitation that can take place. And worse, best case scenario, shame, humiliation, publicly. I mean, so it really is such a fraught topic. I love how you have Eden interviewing certain people who then speak the language that's needed to prevent and empower when it comes to bringing an end to this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point too, because that was such a difficult thing, I think, to navigate, was trying to figure out how to write and like still kind of teach things and still kind of use the language without making it sound like these high schoolers are like suddenly equipped with like terminology that I didn't learn until I was already, probably halfway through my college career. It's definitely it was it was definitely an interesting process trying to figure out how to integrate all of that in. But I think it's a really just important kind of thing to feature people who are external. So there's a character, Kai, who comes in, who basically talks to Eden about, what's going on at St. Joe's and kind of how to handle everything and how to unpack all of it. And I just think having moments like that, or kind of like small interactions where people throw tidbits of information out, is just really helpful. And being able to kind of just like name drop is really useful. I'm a really big fan of the idea of like offering labels or definitions to people and kind of just seeing where they go from there. So being able to say, okay, here's this word, this is what it typically means in research. How, like, what does this mean to you? How do you respond to it? Do you recognize this? Is it something you've seen that maybe you didn't realize how to name? Because I know when I was growing up, we didn't name anything. Like we didn't know what like revenge porn was. It just wasn't really a concept to us. And I think it would have helped tremendously if somebody had been like, hey, this is what it is. This is how to spot it, stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. And what we know is that there's more and more data telling us that when we empower young people with language, so that they can actually articulate their emotional embodied experiences, that they're going to be more inclined to assert themselves and stand up for what they want, to pace themselves sexually, like all those sort of things that we actually want kids to aspire to start to happen when we have direct, real, and honest conversation with them, and give them the language to talk about these very difficult topics that are actually happening, but no one seems to be creating a positive narrative around. Also with adults, I also appreciated, especially as someone who works in schools, that you had like the adult who's really difficult, who's, whose primary focus has to be, legal issues and exposure. And then you have the other adult who's truly an ally for the young people who are trying to do right and fight for something. I really appreciated that too. I thought, there's so much character development and diversity that you can find someone in everything, and that it's not platitudes and stereotypes, but rather, something that's more real and easy to connect to. So I really appreciated that for sure.
Yeah, I know that the kind of like teenagers are the main focus of the book, but I do think there's a lot of interesting things that can come out of the adults too. They're definitely not like the priority, but it's something where I think you can still have interesting discussions about how the parents respond, how adults respond, kind of how they're engaged in the situation, even though they're kind of like almost third party viewers to all of this. I think it could be an interesting discussion. I mean, I wrote it, so I'm a little bit biased, but like I think it could lead to some really interesting kind of, where do I fall in this? What kind of adult am I in, teens' lives, that kind of idea.
Right. And where are my boundaries, and how are those, how those serve kids or they don't, right? I think that that's really important. Also, the different relationships that different kids had with different adults. I thought it was interesting too, sort of also amongst the young women who were perpetrated against, and whose photos were shared in a non-consensual way. There were different responses to trauma, which I think is also a real representation. There's fight, flight, fright, or fawn. And I saw bits of that in everything. It was also interesting too how Eden, Edie's really wanted to honor and respect, and not, because it's all about consent, right? And then a lot of people forget, if you want to be an ally to someone and fight for someone, forget that that's actually an issue of consent too. That they might not want that they may not want to speak out in a public way, that they may not want to interview you with you, because that could actually also trigger experiencing the whole thing again, and re-traumatizing vicarious trauma. Like there's so many aspects to this. And I did appreciate that that was represented, that different people respond to trauma in different ways, and can act in different ways too. I mean, that even when we feel strong and go forward, we can still have so much that's fraught and challenging inside. And ultimately, I think a lot of adults in your book play a role that is inspiring for other adults who may be reading it to think about and reflect upon. Is there anything else in particular that you wanted to share about the book in your process of writing it? And now that it's here, how exciting that is? Or do you want to open it up for Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, we can do Q&A, and then I can see if there's anything that kind of comes up that I can talk in more depth about, if there's anything anybody has any questions about.
Okay. If anyone has any questions, and then if they don't, maybe you want to pick a passage or something to read to create a sense of closure for everyone in our conversation. Okay, so we'll just give it a sec. Anybody has any questions, you can, through Zoom at the bottom of your screen, use the little Q&A box. And then you can also direct message the panelists. I can pick up on any questions anyone may have. Anybody? Okay, and only the hosts and panelists can actually see the questions. All right, well, sounds like our conversation was so efficient. We've covered it all. How about reading a passage from the book,
All right,
and
that
leaving
sounds
us
great.
with a little taster, a little appetizer?
All right, so I'll start from the very beginning, because I actually really I love how the book starts out. I think it's just really interesting, and it really sets the stage super well. So Chapter 1, it had all started with a pair of boobs, more specifically, a photo of Sloane Mares. I looked at the email that I had just opened, sent directly to me, but not only to me. It had been forwarded in a way that could only be described as unfortunate to the entire student body via a listserv, regardless of whether or not the original sender had sent it to everyone on the student email directory, which they had. It would have made its way around the student body with record speed. St. Joseph's High School wasn't so tiny that everyone knew everything, but it was small enough that gossip spread rapidly without consideration for the truth.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know. I when I first picked up the book to read and I read that, I was like, because I was just flipping through it and I was like, wait, I have to sit down and actually start right now. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I
Okay.
I really like the beginning of it because I think it captures kind of that like gossipy feel of it. Like it still feels very
Mhm.
high school, but it's also kind of like, from the perspective of someone who maybe is not necessarily like a gossiper themselves. I think it's just a really kind of interesting dynamic.
There are so many kids in high school situations who are actually witnesses, right? Like who are constantly observing and who are quiet and sort of on the outskirts of what's going on, but have insight into everything that's happening. It's really interesting, and we see some of that in your book too. But I think for a lot of those young people, also because they're witnessing so much of this and trying to make sense of it and understand what their role is, if there is any, it's a particularly valuable, potential conversation to have. All right,
Absolutely.
well, thank you. Um, shall we, how would you like to proceed? Do we want to ask if there are any more questions? Anybody? Okay.
Didn't unmute myself. I was actually curious too if you could talk a little bit about your experience with your original writing and publication on Wattpad, and then this becoming a physical object, both the process of transitioning that and also just the feeling of having it as a physical object versus digital.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting process, and I kind of compare it to something like starting off on like YouTube or SoundCloud, just for like writers in that sense, where you kind of are putting out this very like beginning stage work, and you're like, it might be really good, it might not be. Like I don't know. I'm like, I started writing on there when I was like 14, so I was like, maybe it's really bad. I don't really care, honestly. But when I was writing Revenge of the Sluts, I had this kind of feeling of like this is something where I really want to advocate for it. Like I really want to fight for this particular manuscript. So that was kind of the process for it. I actually went through, kind of general like editing process after I wrote it. I had a couple of like kind of early, almost like beta readers who kind of just like checked it and were like, yeah, this is actually pretty good, that kind of idea, which definitely helped, I think, in the process of being like having my manuscript requested and then going through that process and having it turn into an actual book. I think it was just really nice having kind of input from an early stage and having people who could contribute and kind of just offer things like, oh, this really worked for me, or like this part didn't, or something like that. It's just kind of part of the figuring out myself as a writer and what feedback works for me and what doesn't, things like that. I feel like I grew, I think, in a lot of interesting and kind of like weird ways. And I think it was like having a giant kind of like writers group chat almost, like growing up and kind of figuring it out based on that. So yeah, it's a slightly different process than I think some authors take. It tends to be kind of, the first book tends to be pretty private, I think, in a lot of ways. But I think in this case, it was, kind of a community.
So for if you're interested in writing future books, would you want to try and have that community aspect with your writing again, or do you feel like you're going to have a more traditional approach of writing your manuscript and doing the more traditional route of it?
Yeah, I think I'm still trying to kind of figure out my writing process. Like I've been writing for, a really long time at this point, but I'm still kind of growing and learning and how to be like an adult and a writer and somebody who has to like work and support myself, kind of, figuring out all these different roles. So I feel like my writing process changes with everything that I work on, and like every chapter I write, I'm like, okay, we're gonna do this one slightly differently because of this thing, or because it's, suddenly I have this thing I have to work on when I'm planning on writing. So right now I've been doing a lot of just kind of offline writing because I've been super inconsistent with what I'm writing and what I want to write. And I've also like been going through various like drafts and things have just like not been lining up for me. So it's been, I think I'm going through a little bit of like a kind of COVID burnout of like I can't write anymore. I'm like, please. So but yeah, it's
Oh, froze a little bit.
She flashed, froze.
Give it another
Gonna come
second.
back.
Pops back up.
Okay.
The joys of virtual programming.
I know. The
I
good
mean,
thing is we can all empathize, right? Because it
oh,
happens to all of us.
yeah. Like it's so neat because on one hand, it's bringing like we're all in very different parts of the country, and it's bringing those people in conversation, and that's amazing. I did a event the other day where I'm up in Portland, Maine, and one of the in conversation people was down in Florida, and literally having this coast to coast or this same coast, but one end of the country to the other conversation is fascinating.
Yeah, I'm in San Francisco and you're
Yeah.
in Maine, and Natalie, you're in,
Delaware.
yep. So different time zones, but same context.
Well, it was
Excellent. Sorry, you had frozen, Natalie, when we were talking about your awesome process. And I was just going to say, and you started to talk about it, I heard you say first book, which means there are aspirations for more, which I'm excited about for sure.
Yeah, I have no idea what the process for it's gonna look like, but I'm like I'm still keeping up with it, and I'm still definitely interested in kind of continuing on this pathway of how to kind of integrate, I guess, real life into fiction and how to kind of do the rip from the headlines kind of thing. Or I guess in like a lot of ways it's kind of like ripped from the textbook kind of like it's really cheesy to say that, but like ripped from the textbook kind of idea of like how can I use what I learn in my classes and what I do for my job in my fiction writing.
no, it's really great to be able to have that access to have all those different places of thought, all of those different sources of information that, especially when you're outside of that educational environment, you kind of have to be seeking it out yourself, versus now you can take advantage of the resources that are being given to you. And that is amazing. It's really exciting to hear how you're trying to use those both in the classwork, but then in your personal aspirations as well. Well, it's been really lovely talking with all of you today. Unless anyone else has any other questions or there are other topics that the two of you wanted to discuss.
We do have a question. And the question is, it says, the topic of your book is relatively new to this era. Do you feel that this book is going to be groundbreaking?
Ooh, that's a big word. I to be honest, I kind of hope so. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, this is going to be it. Like, this is going to be the conversation starter of the century. Like, it's going to change everything. But I really do hope that it can kind of make a difference with people and kind of start conversations and just really just like spark something in somebody, whether it's they start to realize the value of better sex ed or they start to realize, oh, slut shaming really is bad, things like that. It's just being able to have those conversations and kind of change minds or open people's minds a little bit more. And because I know there's so much stuff that we missed when we were growing up. And I really hope that that's changed over time. I mean, I was in high school 8 years ago at this point. So I think about it and I'm like, okay, maybe we've had progress, but there's probably things that are still missing. So I wanted to be able to contribute to that. So it might be groundbreaking. If anything, it'll be an interesting, I think, addition to a growing genre of how tech contributes to, modern life and teenagers. And I know that's something we've seen a lot of now is kind of how specifically very modern technology. So things like how influencers operate and things like that have started to be integrated into YA a little bit more. So I consider myself kind of part of that family.
I think too, I've been teaching for 25 years, and a lot of times people will ask me like, what is the thing that's changed the most over time when it comes to healthy sexuality and relationship education? And hands down, it is digital devices and the internet, for sure. And how that's shaped and molded a lot of the teenagers today whose parents aren't digital natives, I think is also huge. And when it comes to, you know, YA fiction and the books that are out there, there are issues of consent at work all the time, but no one's addressing them as explicitly as you did in ways that are real and relevant and that then get at the issue. And so I feel like a lot of the times young people are reading or seeing through media and whatever else, you know, that it's confusing and that they don't know how to make sense of it. But in this book in particular, you structure it so that there is clarity in a lot of different ways, and you're providing information while also doing it through a really good story that's compelling and sucks you in, and you're like, oh, I gotta find out what happens. So I definitely appreciated that. That to me seems like a really new genre that is groundbreaking, for sure. Okay, any other questions? Thank you for that. That was great. Don't see any more. Are you seeing any that I'm not, that I'm missing? I don't think so. No? Okay. Just want to make sure.
Well,
All right.
yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much. I love being able to just like be the fly on the wall of these conversations, but it's one of the things I miss most about being in person is being able to share these thoughts. And while it's certainly not the same on a virtual platform, I feel like it definitely captures some of the same magic. And once again, to our viewers, I just want to remind everyone that you can get your own copy of Revenge of the Sluts. I will repost that link in our Zoom chat because I think sometimes if you jump in after I post, oh, that was the wrong person.
But we also have one last question, which would be great for wrapping things up. What authors have been inspirational to you, Natalie?
Yeah, that's a great question. My inspirations are actually all very kind of like gritty, dark mystery, which is a little bit different. So they're not directly aspirational in that sense, but I think there's a lot of themes. So like I really look up to the way that like Gillian Flynn writes her characters, Karen Slaughter, Riley Sager, writers like that who really kind of dig into like complicated female characters and just the I don't know like the complexity of kind of human emotion and the range and kind of that idea of like female villains or unlikable women and things like that. So I think kind of digging into that and kind of growing within there, that's definitely like a very particular. Oh, and Lane Fargo, her stuff is wonderful. It's like every time I read it, I'm like, oh, this is such a wonderful way of exploring people and psychology and why we do what we do in social interactions and things like that. So kind of, I just find it really interesting, really fun. I'm not gonna say you'll like find those direct themes in my book because it's we're talking mine's a YA. It's mostly kind of a soft, cozy mystery, but I think you can find small ways that they've influenced me.
That's always interesting to see the kind of breadcrumbs that authors take from other people where you like, if you read one book and you read the other book, a reader might not go, oh yeah, I can see the parallels here, but to the author you can clearly see like, oh, these are the themes and the threads that I enjoy about it and the things that I want to feel like I can add to. I think is always fascinating.
Okay.
One last call for questions since they've been coming in. I understand sometimes it takes much longer to type it out than it is to raise your hand and ask something. All right. Well, this has been lovely. If people do have additional questions, what would be a good way to follow up with either of you? Are you active on any particular social media that they could follow you on?
Yes, I am. Let me see. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter. I'll put my @ in the chat box, and you'll be able to find me. And if you have any questions, I think my DMs for both of those are open, or you can just like @ me, I guess, and that I'll try and reach out and respond.
I am also at Shafia Zaloom, and then there's my website, which is just shafiazaloom.com. Anybody can ask any questions, parenting questions, anything like that through there too.
All right, and I will post those over onto the uh, Facebook stream as well. So yes, if you have additional questions, especially once you get your own copy of the book and start reading it and have your thoughts, I'm sure Natalie would love to hear some responses from readers. All right, well, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and it's been great talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.